the time is exciting. As you said, there was this very tiny field called developmental robotics that was started something like 20 years ago, where a small group of people maybe for the first time took seriously the research roadmap proposed by Alan Turing 50 years before about trying to build machines that would learn like a child. You said I was one of the pioneers, but I have to say that you were also one of those pioneers, and Chen Yu and Yuki Nagai, who are the co-organizer of this seminar, were also. And so that's really an honor and great for me that you invited me today. And so the time is exciting because more recently we've seen advances in the field of machine learning, and especially deep learning, where people were not really trying initially to build machines that would learn like children. But now there is, since quite recently, a form of convergence between those two fields that has happened, and which I think is really opening new perspectives. And this field, I like to call it developmental artificial intelligence. And that's basically about trying to build machines that learn like children, but also apply some of those things in domains like education and, for example, help children learn better. So let me try to present an outline of research directions. We've been working with many colleagues over recent years to develop further this domain. So first of all, I just said recently there was major advances in deep learning, and especially deep reinforcement learning, where people have been trying to learn controllers, and we've seen pretty impressive results. So a few years ago, everyone heard about the AlphaGo system, which could learn to play the game of Go and beat the best human players in the world, which was thought to be just impossible 2 or 3 years before. And these advances were not constrained to games like Go, but also went into the real world. So for example, now you have deep reinforcement learning systems that enable robots to walk in a very robust manner in very rough terrain. You've got deep reinforcement learning systems that have been used in to control stratospheric balloon, to bring internet to remote populations. And you've been deep reinforcement learning used, for example, to develop new drugs, which can have high impact in medicine. However, this system, even if they are very impressive, they are very far from the kind of capabilities that human infants have. So indeed, children are extraordinary, not because some of them become world champions in games like Go or chess. Actually, only very few of them become world champions in those games. But this, because nearly all of them acquire efficiently a wide variety of everyday skills like locomotion, building Lego structure, doing bicycles, playing board games, mastering language, etc., etc. And it's always evolving. And this learning is autonomous, which means that there is never an engineer that intervenes by opening the brain to change some parameters or give some specific reward function for a new task. It's also developmental because learning happens progressively with a specific timing and ordering. And so, for example, the infant does not right away learn to walk on 2 feet. First, he learns to hold its head, then later on to sit, to crawl, to stand on 2 feet with one arm on the ground, and progressively to walk on 2 feet. So basically, a fundamental question is how such developmental sequences form. What's the role of these structures? And probably such developmental pathways that we can call also learning curriculum are useful to address a fundamental problem, which is how to guide learning of so many things when you have so little resources of time, of computation, and of energy. And so basically in my team, we've been studying these questions along 3 dimensions. So first, we've been building algorithmic models to help understand better human development. And here we have a lot of interaction with developmental psychology and neuroscience. Then we've been trying to extract those insights and transfer them in machine learning to build more robust, more autonomous lifelong learning machines. And finally, we've been studying how these insights can find applications in various domains, such as educational technologies, for example, for personalizing sequences of exercises to maximize not only learning efficiency, but also motivation, or in the domain of automated discovery in physics or biology. It may seem remote to you, but today I will try to illustrate these different facets, including the applications which may be important in the real world. And then taking a little bit of a step back, the work that we've been doing has been relying over the years on three fundamental ideas coming from developmental psychology. We've been taking inspiration from them, studying them, modeling them. So the first fundamental idea is that the child is autotelic. It means that he is a curious little scientist that's intrinsically motivated to spontaneously explore the world, to make sense of the world, and invents its own learning objective, its own goals. Another fundamental idea is that intelligence is embodied and developed through self-organization of the dynamical system that's formed by the brain-body environment interactions. And finally, the third idea, which I will also develop, is that intelligence develops in a social context for solving social problems. And in this social context, where social peers are pretty key for several things. So first of all, they scaffold learning. They produce a form of socially induced curriculum learning. But also there is the general culture and language in particular, which become internalized and can become cognitive tools. For example, for planning, imagination. Okay, so let's go through various dimensions of research, exploring these fundamental ideas. The first one, the child as a little scientist. So this is, for example, an idea championed by people like Pierre-Yves, but also many others. So one extraordinary property of child development is that they spend a lot of time spontaneously exploring their environment. So they're not doing it because they're externally imposed tasks. Rather, they're driven by different forms of what psychologists call intrinsic motivation, and what we may call, in quotation mark, curiosity in everyday language. And so during exploratory play, for example, they invent and they pursue their own problems. And such intrinsically motivated exploration has been argued to be key for child development for several reasons. So for example, for solving problems with rare rewards, for learning efficiently world models, for discovering open-ended skill repertoires. And so basically we've been trying to work, trying to model these principles. So I said psychologists propose the ideas of intrinsic motivation, and indeed it was proposed already like more than 50 years ago, in the 40s and in the 50s in the last century. And basically psychologists hypothesized that the brain contain circuits that pushed infants to be intrinsically interested by things like novelty, surprise, cognitive dissonance, intermediate novelty, or optimal challenge, for example. But a major limit of this line of work, it was very inspiring, but a major limit was that these hypotheses has remained at a verbal level, and very little work has actually been done until around 20 years ago to understand better the mechanisms and to study this concept more experimentally. But there is a small group of people, actually quite at the same time as the beginning of developmental robotics, that began actually to work on curiosity-driven learning 20 years ago, trying to understand it in humans, trying to model it in machines. And today, it has become a relatively standard topic, even in very traditional machine learning communities, like people who go to NeurIPS conference, for example. Many people talk about curiosity, like those people who want to write papers with many proofs, many mathematics, etc. So that's today very standard. But 20 years ago, when you would come to a conference and you was at the social dinner and then you would say, okay, I am working on curiosity-driven learning, like every people would look at you with big eyes and thinking you are the crazy scientist. You were really crazy. And it was happening not only in AI, but also in neuroscience and in psychology. But things have changed. Things have changed, and actually different communities really took up the work the early work of the psychologists in the 40s and the 50s to study operationally those mechanisms. And so there is a first community basically from which I have come with my colleagues, which has taken its inspiration both from developmental psychology and theoretical biology, where we developed some hypotheses that I'm going to present today. But there are also other communities who developed ideas related to curiosity-driven learning. For example, in machine learning, you had people like Fedorov or John Andreae, who was probably the first to introduce novelty search in reinforcement learning, and then Schmidt-Huber and Roberto and Satino Singh and their colleagues. And then even another community that has, if I can say, evolved similar ideas, but independently, is the evolutionary computation community, like Ken Stanley, Jean-Baptiste Mouret, Stéphane Doncieux, and their colleagues. So on our side, our focus has really been on modeling curiosity-driven exploration in humans, trying to understand how it can be made to work for the acquisition of skills in the real world, and understand how it links to developmental self-organization. And so, as I said, in the last 20 years, a lot of work has been done. The community has changed its views on curiosity. Many collaborations were built up between people of various domains. So, for example, I've been collaborating with Jacqueline Gottlieb, with Linda Smith, with Celeste Kidd, and there are many others. And now there is really an interdisciplinary community in the world working on this topic. And even in neuroscience, which has been very, very reluctant until around 10 years ago to work on those topics, now it's kind of a big topic also. Like you can see, for example, recently, like this made the cover of the Nature Reviews Neuroscience journal. So things have changed, and that's great. And so our theoretical perspective has basically been to see the child as a sense-making organism, as a little scientist that makes experiments to acquire good predictive models of the world, and even more importantly, good models that enable to control the world with their actions. And so most research in psychology, but also research in machine learning, they have so far focused on understanding what kind of mechanisms enable efficient learning if you assume you provide the data for learning, or if you provide externally a given task to the child or to the machine. This is the vast majority of research so far. But however, a very fundamental question, often overlooked, is how an autonomous learner can decide for itself what tasks to learn, when and in what order to learn them, and even learn how to represent novel tasks as new discoveries are made. And so this is a kind of adaptive metacognitive learning architecture that we need, that I am picturing here. And we've been basically trying to understand what kind of mechanism we need on this side to enable efficient, what we say, autotelic learning. Like autotelic learning is this concept that an agent will learn by generating its own objective, its own goals. Okay, so there are different kinds of experiments that children can imagine and choose to pursue, different kinds of learning situations they could choose that correspond to different forms of intrinsically motivated exploration. So a first category that we call knowledge-based intrinsic motivation systems relies on basically generating intrinsic rewards upon visiting some particular states or experiencing transition from a state to another state when you do an action. So such intrinsic rewards include things like prediction errors, uncertainty, and this can be seen as basically enabling an agent to choose to make prediction experiments. And this has often been made on relatively short timescales in the computational modeling literature and in machine learning. And here it's important to realize there is no notion of a goal. This family of intrinsic motivation system is also used primarily for solving later on efficiently problems with external rewards, but with sparse rewards, or for learning efficiently word models. But then there is a second category, which we've been calling competence-based intrinsic motivation, and which is basically at the core of what we call autotelic agents, and which consists in systems where the agent imagines its own goals and selects the one he wants to pursue in what order. And so here the intrinsic reward is basically replaced by a measure of interestingness that's applied to imagined goals, such as, for example, competence progress to reach expected competence progress to reach these generated goals. And so basically the agent is deciding which goal achievement experiment to make. And this has been studied over longer time scales in the literature. And it's been particularly used to enable agents to develop open-ended skill repertoires. So in the talk today, I will actually give examples that are more on that side. I will present basically research about autotelic agents. And so concretely, how does autotelic learning work? So here is the default structure that's common to all algorithms in a class that we've been calling IMGEP, intrinsically motivated goal exploration processes, which is basically a framework that we've developed to try to organize research in this domain of autotelic learning. And so here is the loop. They basically all follow. First, the agent observes a context. Then it samples a goal with an internal goal generator. Then it generates an appropriate sequences of action with a goal condition policy to pursue the goal inside the environment. And then after taking the sequence of action, it uses its own goal achievement function to evaluate for itself its own performances. Sometimes it succeeds, and so it reinforces what is being doing, but sometimes it fails. But even when it fails, most autotelic learning algorithms include some forms of what's called hindsight learning, which basically relabels what was achieved with the goal that could have been imagined and that was actually achieved and was a success. So for example, imagine you want to push a box on the left, you try something, and actually you push it on the right. So you fail on the left, but then you can say, okay, if my goal would have been to push it on the right, now I succeed and I can learn from this. And then based on the data collected, all kinds of internal models are updated. But research on autotelic learning with such a loop poses many challenges to achieve all of this efficiently. And so I'd like here to illustrate a few aspects of how to do that efficiently and how humans might do that. So first, I will discuss the importance of goal sampling strategies, and in particular, how an agent can automate its goal sampling and how it can be made with a form of self-organized learning curriculum. So what's an interesting goal? What's an interesting learning experiment for the brain, may it natural or artificial? So many ideas have been proposed in fields ranging from psychology to biology to AI, often quite independently. So one idea is that an interesting experiment is one which leads to the experience of high novelty or high prediction errors. But well, in the real world, it's not going to work at all. For example, this could lead a robot to spend his whole day staring through the window, making movements with the arms and trying to predict how the color of cars passing by may change as a function of its movements. Always prediction errors, of course. But among other ideas, I will now explain one idea that have been developed with other colleagues, and we studied a lot, that's inspired initially from the work of Varela and Maturana in biology, and that's around the concept of empirical learning progress. And so this idea is that the interestingness of a learning situation, of a goal, for example, is proportional to empirical change in goal achievement error. So basically how much you improve to achieve the goal. But this change can also not be an improvement, but it can be a decrease in competencies, which will enable, as we will see, to drive interest to parts of an environment that change or skills that are being forgotten. And so this idea, we've been calling it the learning progress hypothesis, but in practice, it includes also learning regress. So that's absolute learning progress. And so such a mechanism can actually automatically self-organize exploration along a curriculum. And to visualize how, let's imagine a situation where you have a robot that can explore 4 sensory motor activities that are different and characterized by different learning rates, as we see on top of the graph. So each curve here shows the evolution of the errors in each activity if you would assume the learner would focus on practicing each of them for a long time. But then exploration driven by the learning progress principle will result in avoidance of activities that are too easy or too difficult to learn, and first focus on the activity with the fastest learning rate, and eventually when it starts to reach a plateau, to switch to the second most promising learning situation. So let's study this idea in the context of a real simulated robot environment, such as this one. So here the robot is free to choose or switch to any goal he might learn and achieve. So in this particular experiment, he's given a space of goals in which he can sample from, which includes a variety of things like reaching various objects, grasping various objects, stacking some objects. But one challenge is that we put distractors. For example, we put objects in the environment that move randomly or that are too far away to be controlled by the robot. And thus, there are many goals in this goal space that are just impossible to learn, such as, for example, stacking uncontrollable objects. But initially, the robot does not know that there are goals that are uncontrollable, and he doesn't know which one. And also among feasible goals, some are easy, some are more difficult, and some depend on mastering previous other skills to become learnable. And so basically, if the robot samples goals randomly here, it will be very inefficient at learning. So there is really a need for automated curriculum learning, and this is realized by sampling the goals according to their expected absolute learning progress. And so in practice, it's posing several technical difficulties. So one of them is how to estimate, how to track, how to predict the learning progress for various goals, because you cannot observe that directly. So you need to estimate that. And so for this, we develop specific approaches based on specific kinds of regression models, and especially in particular, non-stationary regression models. And then another challenge is how to find efficiently the niches of learning progress. What kind of goals might provide further learning progress? And for this, we've been using bounded algorithms that are dedicated to non-stationary problems, because indeed, a kind of learning situation or goal that provide learning progress at the point does not provide any more learning progress later on when you've learned it by construction. But today, I won't delve into those technical details. I rather want to focus on what are the good properties of this sampling scheme when you assume you already can estimate well the learning progress. So on the right, we see actually the emergence of a learning curriculum, where on the top, you see the progressive acquisitions of skills of increasing complexity. And on the bottom, you see the estimates of learning progress, which are basically proportional to the probabilities to select each goal type. And we can basically check that here the tasks 5, 6, and 7, which are the unlearnable ones, are indeed very little sampled. And so basically, it means that the robot has learned to sample the goals of appropriate complexity, of appropriate learnability, avoiding those that are either too easy or too difficult. And another good property of this goal sampling scheme is that it can address what people have called catastrophic forgetting. So catastrophic forgetting happens sometimes with neural networks. When you train them on new tasks, basically erases what was learned about the previous task. And so here we see this phenomenon after after mastering the green type of goal on the left, the robot focuses on the yellow one, and this leads to a drop in performance in the green one. So this is actually catched by the estimate of absolute learning progress, which we actually see in the middle, where there is a new bump, a second bump in the green curve. And then the green task is repracticed again, and we see that on the selection probabilities curve on the right. And then in the end, it's reacquired, and everything ends up mastered. And so in the model I just described, the goal space representation was handmade, but it's also possible that autotelic agents learn this space. For example, in the case of robots perceiving raw images. So one natural approach has been to train, for example, what's called a generative model, such as a variational autoencoder, to learn an embedding of images, and then to sample goals in that embedding. So this was, for example, made in the rig work with uniform sampling in the prior, but also in another work we did with the algorithm we called UGL, or another team did something they called SkewFit, where goals are basically sampled on the frontier of the known distribution of goal. And this is basically implementing a form of novelty search when sampling the goals in the learned representation space. So the advantage is that it enables much more autonomy as compared to the system before, but because it is doing some form of novelty search, it's not going to be robust to environment with distractors or many objects. And so to deal with this and to address robustness to distractors, we've been applying the learning progress idea, for example, in the GRIMGEP system, where we use a learning progress-based bandit and where the arms are unsupervised learned clusters in the learned embedding, for example, using Gaussian mixture models. We've been also using approaches using beta variational encoders to learn disentangle embeddings, like to learn a representation separating different objects from raw pixels that enable further organization of the learning progress-based exploration. Okay. So the learning progress hypothesis that we initially proposed and developed as a theoretical approach to understand how humans can explore large spaces of tasks, potentially with many distractors. So far, I've been talking to you mostly about studying this hypothesis in the context of seeing how it enables machines to learn autonomously and efficiently in artificial environments. But a big question is basically whether humans actually use learning progress to organize their curiosity-driven exploration. And so, of course, we wanted to test that in humans. It remained to be tested in humans at this until recently. And this is exactly what we did in a paper that's now in press in Nature Communication, and which is joint work with Jacqueline Gottlieb in New York, in Columbia University. And so in this experiment, we propose basically to humans 4 learning tasks that they are free to explore, and they are not given any objectives. These tasks are basically about learning what food types certain monsters with different shapes and from different families prefer. And there is basically one task that's very easy to learn. There are 2 tasks that are more difficult to learn, but still learnable, and one that is really difficult to learn, but learnable. And there is one task which on purpose is made completely unlearnable, but people don't know. And so there is also a control group of people to whom we gave explicitly the objective of maximizing learning. And we had this group to see whether the free group would actually do the same. And so a first result that we obtained is that indeed a substantial part of the free exploration group actually behaved in a very similar pattern than the group to whom we asked to maximize learning. But so we made many analyses. Today, I'm not going to enter into the detail. I will focus on one computational modeling analysis where we've been studying which utility function, considering a space of many potential utility functions that include alternative hypotheses to the learning progress hypothesis, for example, minimizing or maximizing prediction errors. And basically, we've been trying to find which are the utility functions that explain best human exploration. And what we've been finding is that the utility function that explain best human exploration actually include as a key component the estimate of absolute learning progress. So that was a very encouraging first step to show that humans might use learning progress to monitor their exploration. Okay, there are many things to be said about this, but let me go now to, we went now to pretty fundamental research. Let us go to applications, and then later on I will go back to fundamental research and again to applications. Okay, now I'd like to try to see concrete applications that are possible from this fundamental research on autotelic learning and the learning progress-based hypothesis. So the first application is for machine learning. So here the idea is to actually reuse learning progress-based automatic curriculum learning, especially approaches based on Gaussian mixture models, to train very classical deep reinforcement learning agents that are given one external task, for example, learning to locomote robustly. And we basically want them to acquire policies that can robustly locomote in various kind of environments with various kinds of obstacles. And to foster generalization, one approach is to use procedural content generation so that one can generate diverse environments for training. But then the challenge is how to control the evolution of sample environments, especially when you might have a deep reinforcement learning student with initially unknown capabilities, with a body that has unknown capabilities also, and many parameters in the procedural generation, for example, controlling the shape and the spacing of obstacles. And you don't know really what's learnable, what's not learnable, what's easy, what's difficult. And so actually you can use the learning progress-based system to organize the curriculum. And what we've been showing is that if you use such an approach as opposed to random sampling of environments, which is actually often done in the deep reinforcement learning domain, then not only you can learn much faster policies, but actually even if you let a lot of time to the random curriculum, it may never end up learning policies, for example, to go over certain categories of obstacles we show here, whereas with automated curriculum learning, it will actually learn very robust policies that will enable a wider variety of generalization. And so basically, we've been showing this in a very robust manner. We've been using this kind of teacher algorithms to train many different kinds of different reinforcement learning systems, many different algorithms for many different bodies, for many different environments. And we've actually provided a benchmark that's called Teach My Agents with all the code for those who want to build on that. But because this approach to automatic curriculum learning is very robust and is initially inspired by models of human curiosity-driven learning, another natural use is to personalize learning curriculum for children in the domain of educational technologies. So instead of generating a learning curriculum for robots and machine learning algorithms, here we were able to show that a learning progress-based automatic curriculum can actually allow to generate personalized curriculums for human learners to maximize learning efficiency and motivation. So an example is the personalization of sequences of exercises for learning mathematics that we've been exploring and experimenting in primary schools in a pretty large scale. A few years ago, with a first experiment over 1,000 children, I'm going to present you the result, and now it's now being disseminating at large to thousands of children. But the basic idea is to track for each student its learning progress according to various properties of exercises and incrementally propose exercises that maximize learning progress. So the principle is really the same as before. There is a space of exercises that's organized in a graph. So here there is this graph, which is brings a little bit more structures. It allows to bring also a little bit of expert knowledge to hot start the system. And each node is a family of exercise with similar parameters from which one can sample. So the system is hot started by considering only easy nodes in the graph, and it's using learning progress to sample exercises in the different kinds of exercises corresponding to these nodes. Actually, to be precise, the system does not completely impose exercises, but it recommends a few exercises to the child from this pool, and the child makes the final choice. And then as the learning proceeds, the set of nodes in the bandit evolves in direction of high learning progress and so on. And so we were basically able to show that such automated personalized curriculum allowed to bring all children to higher levels than curriculum that were handmade by a pedagogical expert. And this was especially the case for children that were either with special difficulties or special talents. And these kind of children, typically, they don't fit well with the handmade curriculum that are made by experts. So here, basically, we can address better the diversity of children. And also we show that not only it enables better learning, but also the state of intrinsic motivation in children that use the system is basically better than the intrinsic motivation of children who've been using the system made by a pedagogical expert. And recently, we've been actually working with a consortium of educational technologies companies, which are now integrating this approach in a large-scale educational solution, which is called Adaptive Math, to be disseminated in a very large scale in France. Okay, and finally, I'd like to talk about another very interesting and broad area of application of autotelic learning algorithm. They can actually be used as autonomous discovery assistant for scientists that study and explore the emergence of highly structured patterns in many complex dynamical systems that run from biological organisms, chemical systems, and even artificial ones like the game of life. So in those so-called morphogenetic systems, we are still far from grasping the range of structure that can self-organize, and we believe autotelic learning can help. So for example, here, Jonathan Rizou in the lab of Licronin. Jonathan Rizou was a previous PhD in our team, and he went in this chemistry lab to use autotelic learning algorithm to explore the behavior of oil droplets that are used by chemists to study the origins of life. And basically, those algorithms were used to control an automated factory robotic factory that makes automatically experiments. And basically, they could show that by using the goal exploration algorithm, they could actually discover a wider diversity of phenomena that they knew before. And recently, we've also been using these approaches to explore the formation of organized structures in a continuous game of life, which has been a very important test bed over the years for fundamental questions in artificial life and theoretical biology. Recently, actually, in a series of papers, and also one we are working right now, we managed actually to show maybe for the first time how it's possible to evolve sensory motor agency in continuous sensory motor automata. So maybe many of you are familiar with the gliders in the cellular, in the game of life, which is a kind of spatially localized pattern. But this kind of glider did not really have sensory motor behavior. Like it's the emergence of a body, but with no organized interaction with the environment and no way to preserve their integrity if they are perturbated by the environment. What we could evolve here with autotelic learning are whole creatures. Initially, there is only an environment, and we emerge localized creatures, localized body, which can move around and which can, for example, have sensory motor behavior by being robust to perturbations like obstacles, go around them, and actually generalize very strongly. Okay, so let's go now to the second fundamental idea I mentioned initially. An idea in particular was championed by Linda Smith and Esther Telen, as well as many others, which is that intelligence is embodied and developed through the self-organization of the dynamical form by brain-body environment interactions. One way that's very fundamental to see what it means, this approach is trying to understand the role of physics in generating organized walking or locomotion. Many people have thought for a long time that locomotion was a complicated control problem when the brain had to decide every millisecond what's the optimal sequences of motor signals to send for maximizing a certain cost, like walking forward without falling and spending energy. But people like Ted McGeer, for example, they said, okay, what about building a pair of legs with no motors, with no computer, but with a geometry that is similar to human legs? And it could show that by the interaction between the mechanical structure and the gravity, there is a self-organization of a gait that's very robust and human-like. And this is the same idea that we've been exploring with Olivier Lee, in particular a few years ago, when now we began to build a robot with a vertebral column inspired by human physiology with elastics that were at different places. And we could show with only very, very simple controllers, with no model at all of the body and no models of the interaction with the environment, only very basic reactive systems, that these robots could be very robust in equilibration, but also could produce in an emergent manner forms of interaction with human people. Like, for example, we discovered that in a public show that little children would take the hand of the robot and the robot would follow. No one programmed this. It is just a spontaneous consequence of the interaction between gravity, the elastics, and the forces, the small forces that are applied by the robot, by the human. So basically, this idea of the body providing structure can be also combined with autotelic learning. So for example, this is what we've been doing in an experiment where we've been using a platform and in which we've been giving to the robots what we've called dynamic motion primitives. This is something developed in the robotics field, initially inspired to model certain kinds of neuromuscular synergies observed in certain animals. And here we've been equipping those robots with those dynamical systems to produce organized movements. And then combined with the autotelic learning algorithm I presented before, we were basically able to show that a robot in an environment that it initially doesn't know, with a body it initially doesn't know, by exploring goals ranging from trying to move the hand, which is initially an object like any other, to move distant objects, some of them being distractors. We have things that move alone, in the room. We have things that are too far away to be controlled. And we have more complicated toys that are learnable, but pretty complicated. And we saw the emergence in just a few hours of an organized learning curriculum where initially, after sampling a little bit everything, the robot discovered that it's more interesting to sample goals in terms of movement of the hand. And then progressively, he learns how to control the hand. And then it samples goals about moving the two joysticks in front of me. And one of them is especially interesting because it happens to control the electric toy in front. And then now the robot samples goals about the electric toy. And in a very, after just a few hours, it ends up being able to use the electric toy to move the ball around, as you will see in a second, in a way that's far from trivial. Actually, if you would use a traditional deep reinforcement learning algorithm with low-level action, so without motion primitives and with only an external reward for moving the ball and no autotelic learning at all, it will never work, just never work. It would take millions of years to learn this. Okay, so now is another related experiment that's more grounded to child development and where basically one studies how the exact same mechanism can participate to structure vocal development. So the exploration of sound that can be produced with the vocal tract. So an additional mechanism here is that the curiosity-driven learning mechanism was also used to let the robot decide when to try to imitate the speech sounds of a caregiver model or when to explore other self-selected kinds of sounds. And so these models relied on a physical model of the vocal tract, of the motor control, of the auditory system, and includes also a model of vocalization of social peers. And again, experiment showed an autonomous self-organized exploration. Within an initial self-exploration phase, the following sequence appears. So the vocal learner first discovers how to control phonation, just to produce sound, then to focus on vocal variations of unarticulated sounds, things like R, R, R. And finally, automatically discovers and focuses on babbling with articulated proto-syllables. And so as the vocal learner becomes more proficient at producing complex sounds, imitating vocalization of peers starts to provide learning progress, and now it's focusing on this imitation. And this is exactly the same kind of transition that we observe in many infants, as showed by David Oudeyer and his colleagues. And it's important to know that here, the self-organized trajectory is the result of the dynamic interaction between the learning system, the intrinsic motivation system, the body, and the environment. And so if we run experiment many times, one observes at the same time strong regularities, and also diversity in the developmental trajectory. So for example, some phases and sequences of phases appear very often, but sometimes some phases are reversed, and even some simulated agents have weird developmental trajectories, and with exactly the same mechanism and the same parameters. And this duality between regularities and diversity is also very typical of child development. And in fact, here this can be understood as the system is a dynamical system where you have different developmental trajectories that can be seen as attractors, and the contingencies that are encountered by the learner makes it fall with different probabilities in each of them, in each of these attractors. And I won't enter into the detail, but we've basically been doing similar studies to model the development of some aspects of tool use. But let's go to the last fundamental idea. So this fundamental idea is that it's very important to not forget that human intelligence develops in a social environment. And so first of all, it means that if we want to understand human intelligence, or if we want to build human-like intelligence in machines, we need to understand very deeply the family of problems they have evolved to solve, humans have evolved to solve, and the key problems humans specifically evolved to solve are social problems. So it means we probably need to understand how to provide rich social environments to machines. And more than this, the social perspective, as for example, developed by Vygotsky, shows that social environments, social peers, are also providing guidance, a form of socially induced curriculum learning to help children develop. And finally, and that's pretty fundamental, social communication tools and language are internalized to become cognitive tools, for example, for planning or imagination. And I'm going to illustrate a few recent work we made to explore those ideas, and especially this last idea of language as a cognitive tool. If we come back to the autotelic learning architecture I described so far, the spaces in which agents could sample goals, all corresponding to very concrete goals, such as producing a precise movement or a precise visual pattern with an object. Furthermore, when using generative models to sample the goals, for example, the variational autoencoders I was speaking about, even if we did novelty search within those spaces, the sampling happened within the distribution of known goals. But to power creative exploration, this is what we want, agents would need to generate novel, creative, and abstract goals that are really out of the distribution of what they have already seen. And this process, for doing this process, children use language. So Vygotsky showed that children speak to themselves as a tool to generate goals and to plan, to make plans to solve these goals. So language is indeed compositional by nature, and it can push the limits of the known towards the unknown. So for example, if I know what a cat and a bus are, then I can easily compose the two to generate a new concept, a cat bus. And once I have this linguistic concept of a cat bus, then it's very easy to picture in the mind what it could look like. And so the compositionality of language can thus be used to generate out of distribution goals to imagine new goals from known ones. So inspired by this, we recently introduced the Imagine system, starting from basically state-of-the-art language-guided deep reinforcement learning system that were developed in the recent years. And so there is a first phase, which is relatively classical, where basically the agent is going to interact with the social peer and learn language-guided policy. So more precisely here, we have an environment where you have, so that is a very visually simple environment, but it's actually very rich from a compositional point of view because you have many kinds of objects that can be combined, a little bit like in Minecraft. If you know Minecraft, the difference is that here it's visually much more simple, but the combinatoriality is quite similar. And so there is a first phase of learning that is guided by the social peer. And so here the agent explores an environment that is procedurally generated with a lot of compositional action. And the agent, when the agent does something that is relevant to the social peer, then the social peer provides at the end of the behavioral trajectory. That's important because it's not the social peer never produces instructions or commands. It's only at the end, it provides a language description of what was done. And that's very important, these descriptions are used by the agent to learn several things. The first thing is very classical. It's going to learn a policy that is conditioned by language goals. But then it's going to learn an internal model of the guidance provided by the social peer, like learning an internal model of what the social peer would say or think if he does a certain thing, even if the social peer is not there anymore. And so basically the thing he will internalize for the social peer and learn are first a goal achievement function, which later on will enable the agent to assess by itself whether a language goal has been achieved. It will learn also a captioner that basically is going to enable the agent to produce its own linguistic description about its own discoveries, which in turn will enable hindsight learning. And it's going to learn a goal generator, basically enabling to imagine new goals, and which is going to be based on the compositional structure that is discovered in the language through the interaction. And something that's very important to realize is that the language model is not only a model of language, it is also a model of relevance. It's basically a model of what the social peer would find interesting in the real world. Language is conveying this relevance knowledge. And so now comes the most interesting part. After the first phase, there is now an autonomous exploration phase in which the social peer does not speak anymore. Here, the agent now reuses its learned goal generator to sample its own goal. And it's not only sentences that were already uttered by the social peer, but new sentences that use the compositionality. Like you can see on the left, for example, maybe in the past with the social peer, the agent saw grasped red tree or grasped red algae or grow blue algae. Now it's able to imagine a new goal by recombining and saying, for example, oh, maybe I could try to grow the red tree. And so basically it means that the goal sampling process is going also to be guided by the relevance model that's encoded in the language model. And then it's going to use its learn goal achievement function to generate its own feedback and learn from it. And it's going to use the learn captioner for goal relabeling and hindsight learning. So for example, imagine that the agent aimed to grow the red tree, but it failed. But maybe in the end, it managed to grasp a new kind of object, to grasp, I don't know, the yellow algae, for example. Then it will be able to describe linguistically what it just did and to learn about it. And so basically now the agent explores by using language to imagine new goals and really learns using fundamentally this internalized model of the social peer. And so to evaluate such mechanism for out of the social language goal imagination, we've been making a whole series of experiments studying the capacity of the agent to achieve goals, for example, from a holdout test set of linguistic goals that the social peer was not allowed to say in the first phase. So we're sure these are goals that the social peer never taught to the agent. And so we could see that the agent actually can generalize to those language goals, test language goals, much better than if he was only learning in a traditional way by the social peer guidance without imagining its own goals using the internal model of the social peer. We've actually been studying various alternative implementation of this idea, showing that it's very robust on the particular way you do the goal imagination. So that's a very strong idea. We've also been able to show that there are several kinds of generalization that it enables from the language, that we've been also able to show that it's enabled to reach very efficiently. It's enabled to explore very efficiently in an environment. And finally, we have some fun qualitative analysis, like seeing an agent, for example, imagine the goal of growing a plant, which is a goal that was never uttered by the social peer. And then it's going to first try to do it by giving food to the plant because it's policy generalizing a strategy for growing animals that is learned with the social peer. But then the internal learned goal achievement function sees it doesn't work and self-supervises the agents to adapt its behavior and to learn the right behavior, which is basically to bring water. Okay, and then finally, before I conclude, a very short word of a project that is at the very beginning right now with a few colleagues, but I think I'm very excited about that because I think it's something we need to do. I said that if we want to develop human-like intelligence, human-like agents with human-like intelligence, we need to really address frontally the social context. In most existing deep learning and deep reinforcement learning work you've been seeing in machine learning and in AI recently, I'm speaking about the machine learning domain, not developmental robotics, in which all those issues are very traditional, but I'm thinking about deep reinforcement learning, which have contributed amazing methods. But those methods have not at all been tested in a social context. For example, you know the Atari suite of video games, which has been instrumental and great to propel progress in the recent years in this field, but there is no social dimension at all. And so what we believe is that we need to develop rich environments in which there are many kinds of social peers, social problems, on which we can use those environments to foster the development of social intelligence and also to test social intelligence in agents. And so this is, we have a first version of this, which we call social AI, which is only a draft. It will evolve a lot, which enables to foster things like the development of various aspects of theory of mind, learning interaction protocols, which psychologists call pragmatic frames in the term used by Jerome Brunner. So if you want to discuss this, I'll be happy to discuss this further after this talk and offline. So let me conclude. I'd like to conclude by just saying again those three fundamental ideas that I think are very key for developmental AI and should be used to structure research further. The child is autotelic. The child learns by generating its own learning objective, its own goals. Intelligence is embodied and developed through self-organization of the interaction between brain, body, and environment, which also includes the fact that to understand intelligence, you don't only need to develop complicated algorithmic learning models, but you need to understand how to provide adequate bodies and adequate environments. And among the properties of adequate environments, it's very fundamental to understand that the social context is key. And it's not only key to develop social intelligence, but also because social skills like language become internalized and become cognitive tools that are fundamental even for individual thinking and development. And I've been also showing, and I've tried also to show you today that this fundamental research can have many real-world and societally important applications in domains as diverse as educational technologies, robotics, automated discoveries, etc., etc. And I'll finish by just saying a major thanks to many PhDs, postdoc engineers, senior colleagues with whom I have been working across the years. There are actually even many more, but whose work is amazing. I couldn't have time to present today, but all this work is only possible with them. So thank you very much.